I'm one of the Primavera P6 trainers and implementation specialists at TEPCO. In this TEPCO YouTube session, I'm going to show you some basic information around using the Primavera P6 leveling functionality. Leveling resources is an important part of project scheduling. However, when we talk about using the P6 leveling functionality, either during our TEPCO P6 training courses or while working at client sites, we find that most P6 schedulers are opposed to using it. A majority of the time, this opposition is simply due to a lack of understanding of how the leveling components work in P6. Let's start by reviewing the common statements we tend to hear and address some of the myths around P6 leveling. One of the most common statements I've heard is that leveling will damage my project schedule. This is not correct. People tend to avoid leveling thinking that it's going to scatter their activities and they're not going to be able to get anything back the way they had it. All you have to do is schedule the project again. It'll redo a forwards and backwards pass on it and recalculate the float, and the leveling will go away and you will have a scheduled project. So you never have to worry about leveling. It gets undone immediately when you reschedule the project. Another misconception is that leveling breaks or overrides the logic relationships assigned. This is not correct. Leveling only delays activities to meet resource demands. It does not break or override the logic. So all the logic stays intact. It does not rearrange the activities into another sequence. It retains the original sequencing. All it does is really spread out the activities within a plan, typically within the available float, in order to accommodate the resource demands. Next, leveling will increase activity durations in order to lower the head count, or the budgeted units per time. This is also not correct. Leveling will not change the activity durations, so you don't have to worry about it stretching your activity durations in order to lower the budgeted units per time. The leveler will not override the P6 scheduling settings or the activity duration types. So if an activity can't be leveled due to resource unavailability, it's simply not going to level. What will happen is you will see the overload still in P6, and then you will have to look at that and figure out how to correct it, whether or not you assign another resource to it or make some sort of change to take away that over allocation. One thing that happens is people level their schedule and they realize that the leveling has pushed out the project finish date. This is dependent on the leveling settings. If you have a predefined project schedule duration, which is typically defined by the length of the critical path, you can tell P6 in the leveling settings to only level within total float. This will prevent P6 from leveling past the finish of the project. On the other hand, maybe your project schedule is driven by resource availability rather than by critical path. This means that you have a critical mass amount of hours within the schedule, but not really a fully defined critical path, or maybe there isn't a critical path, or maybe the critical path is short, but the amount of man hours and the availability of resources is causing the duration of that project to exceed the duration of the critical path. We like to call this critical mass at TEPCO. In this case, you can tell the P6 leveler to level out as far as it will to accommodate the resource requirements, in which case P6 is now telling you, based on your resource availability and the amount of hours that you have in the schedule, this is where your project is going to finish. I mentioned earlier that P6 delays activities to accommodate resource availability. I've worked with job coordinators who insist that once they get their hands on a job inside a P6 schedule, that they're going to work on it and they're going to move through the activities sequentially as scheduled without any gaps or delays in between the activities. But if your logic, resource assignments, budgeted hours, and resource limits are correct in P6 and over allocation is showing in the resource profile, then you'll most likely delay activities while waiting for a resource to show up. Although some people may not like or understand why activities get delayed when leveling, we rely on the P6 leveler to simulate how things could actually occur in the field. This is assuming that our parameters have been entered correctly in P6, which includes the logic, the resource assignments, the amount of hours, and the resource limits. A lot of times P6 schedulers will use logic ties or constraints to try and manually level a schedule. This technique creates an issue with the schedule in regards to float. Whenever a constraint is applied to push a sequence of activities out to the right, it reduces float. Also, if we cross-link unrelated job plans to each other and reschedule, this also reduces the float. During project execution, we may find that specific job plans are executed out of sequence in comparison to the original plan. We then may have to break and retie logic to adjust for the out-of-sequence work. We may also have to remove invalid constraints. This technique binds up the schedule and prevents P6 from working dynamically. Keep in mind that P6 looks at numerous elements when leveling. It considers the activity sequencing, the resource limitations, the float, and the activity priorities. When a P6 project schedule contains hundreds or even thousands of activities, it's highly unlikely that any person could manually level a schedule using constraints or logic ties to the extent that P6 can. Before I take you into P6, let's take a look at a diagram to explain leveling concepts. Here's a box that has a bottom and the two sides, but the top has not been put on yet. First, we're going to fill the box in with circles. We'll start with red, indicating the most important ones that need to go in first. It'll be followed by some yellow ones, and then some more yellow and some green ones, and finally some blue ones on the top. Now, if we put a lid on this box, some of the circles are going to have to push to the right in order to fit inside. If we overfill the box with too many circles, we will need to make some changes. There are three options here. We can increase the size by increasing the height, or we could keep the same height and increase the length of the box, in which case the circles would have to move over to the right to fit inside. The third option is to remove some of the circles and not try and put that many into the box. Now you're probably wondering what this has to do with P6 leveling. The length of the box is the project duration. The height of the box is the project man hours. There's a limit on the box, which is the resource limit. There's also the finish, which is the right side of the box, and there's the data date, which is the left side of the box. In this P6 example, we have the data date, we have the duration of the project defined by the critical path, which is also defined by the project finish and a constraint on the project finish. And down in the histogram, we have the hours along with the limit of the resource availability. Now, if we want to fit the resource hours inside of this box, we're going to have to push the activities to the right, just like we did with the circles in the previous diagram. Once that's done, the resource allocation is resolved. Now let's go look at some examples in P6 directly. The example I'm using contains 3 activities in it. I'm using the P6 built-in activity leveling priority of 1 through 5, and of the 3 activities I've labeled them 1 through 3, and I've also set the priorities 1, 2, and 3 on the 3 activities. None of the activities are linked to each other, but they are all linked to a finish milestone. The finish milestone has a constraint on it. Also, the activities are scheduled in hours, and I've set them each to 10 hours of duration. And if we look down below here, I've assigned 1 resource to them. I've set a resource limit, so that's basically the top of the box. And we can see right here that with the activities running in parallel, we would need about 3 people rather than our limit of 1 person. So I've made the total float and the remaining float columns visible here, and I just wanted to note that the total float on these activities is 20 hours. This is the distance between each of the activities and the amount of float they have available before they impact the constrained finish milestone. Let's look at the level settings. You can either hit Shift F9 on your keyboard, or you can hit the level tool button at the top. And what I want to point out is this option right here, level resources only within activity total float. This is commonly overlooked, and by default it is not turned on for a new project. What this means when it's on is that my activities will only level within the total float that they have available. Now the total float is identified by the logical sequences that are tied into other activities, or in this case specifically the project finish milestone. So I need to make sure that's turned on if I don't want my activities to level beyond what my project finish is expected to be. The other thing I'll note down at the bottom here is the leveling priorities. I mentioned I was using the activity leveling priority 1 through 5 that is built into P6. You can actually use activity codes or other elements for that, but for this example I'll be using the 1 through 5 activity leveling priority. Also, I always put total float as the last line item in my leveling priorities. This means that if my codes or my activity leveling priority code has a tie between two activities, then it's going to level out the one that has more float available. So whichever one of the activities has more float is going to move to the right. So now I'm going to level the project and watch what happens to the 3 activities. They have all leveled out based on their priorities that have been assigned. So the first one with the top level priority has stayed towards the left side on the data date. The one with the second level priority has moved into second position, and the third one has moved into the last position. Now I'm going to change my activity leveling priorities on the activities on a couple of them just so you can see the difference that occurs. I'm going to change this one that says 2, and I'm going to set that to the lowest. Now I'm going to level again and watch what happens here. Now my activities have automatically resorted, so you can see that activity number 2 has moved down to the bottom. This is because I had my auto sort still turned on. I'm going to click my activity ID header just to sort them back to the way they were. And you'll see that the second activity number 2, because it had the lowest priority, has now shifted out to the third position on Wednesday. And what was previously out in the third position on Wednesday has now drawn back in to Tuesday. The leveler has rearranged the activities based on my changing of the activity leveling priority. Another thing I want to note here, if I go back to the level window, is what happens if I don't have leveling priorities assigned. So if I were to remove this, and I'll remove total float as well, and I'm going to level it. It actually levels based on the activity ID, which of course doesn't make any sense in most cases. The point here is that if you don't set your leveling priorities in some manner, whether it's an activity code or the built-in 1 through 5 code, and then also have secondary priorities set like I did with the total float, P6 is only going to look at the activity ID when it levels. And that's because it will still level, but it needs to default to some sort of code or mechanism to tell it how to level. And built into the system, the activity ID is the default in the background. Typically, we wouldn't want that to happen. So we need to make sure that our parameters, the leveling priorities, and possibly total float is what I recommend as the tiebreaker at the end. We need to make sure that those are always set in the leveling window. In this next example, I've taken the finish constraint on this project and I have actually backed it up or moved it to the left one day. So now it's on Tuesday rather than Wednesday. What this has done is it's reduced the float. So I have 3 activities still. It's the same example as before, but I have reduced the float on it, and I want to show you what happens when we level this. So I'll hit the level button. Notice how the second activity has moved out to Tuesday, but the third activity didn't move at all. This is because it did not have enough float to level all 3 activities. So what P6 did is it did consider the first 2 and it leveled them as it could. But once it saw this third activity, it said, well, I can't move it. I'm overloaded on Monday, but even if I move it to Tuesday, I'm still going to be overloaded. So in that case, P6 kind of chokes on it and says, you know what, I don't know what to do with this one, so I'm not going to move it at all. The point I'm trying to make here is that P6 does not do things by random when it comes to leveling. There are some people I've met that think that it's not static or the same every time. And the truth is, if you level a project over and over again and you don't change any of the parameters, you are going to get the same leveling results every time. It does not roll the dice and say, well, I'll leave it here for now, and then next time I level it, it decides it's going to move it out or halfway out or anything like that. There is a reason why P6 levels activities into the positions that it levels them into. The real trick is to troubleshoot if you do have an overload like this one that I'm displaying. You need to be able to troubleshoot what the problem is and get the problem resolved. Another issue I've seen is where maybe one of the activities has 2 resources assigned to it, but our limit is of 1. Right there we already have a problem because we're limited to 1 resource, but we accidentally assign 2 resources, 2 of the same resources, to that activity. If P6 sees that, it will not level it either because it doesn't know what to do with it. It basically chokes on it. Now, still using the same example where I still have the constraint on Tuesday, I'm going to go up to the level settings and I'm going to tell P6 to not level within activity total float. So I'm going to take this one off. And remember, I mentioned earlier that this is the one that gets overlooked most commonly. Now I'm telling P6 just go ahead and level it. In this case, it's going to level it and it's going to make the activities push out to accommodate for any resource overloads that we have. So watch what happens here. P6 actually ignored the fact that it's tied to this finish milestone, and it pushed the finish milestone out now. It did level, but now our project duration is longer than what we had previously where we were trying to complete the project on Tuesday. So when you see P6 leveling your activities and it pushes past your project finish date, or it pushes your project finish date out, it's possible that maybe you don't have a constraint on that finish milestone, or maybe you don't have all of the paths of activities linked into that final finish. And remember, it's good practice in P6 scheduling or any scheduling tool to make sure that you have logical sequencings flowing from a start point into a final finish point. The completion of a project is dependent upon all the deliverables being complete. So if these deliverables are all in your P6 plan, then you need to make sure that all activities are completed prior to saying that the project is complete. In this next example, I've moved the project finish constraint back out to Wednesday and I have rescheduled. So now we're back to where we started and we are overloaded. I'm going to go ahead and level again. I am going to level within activity total float. Now, what happens sometimes is some schedulers think, okay, well, I've leveled it, I've let P6 level it, and maybe I like what I see here. So how do I lock this down so it doesn't move anymore? The answer is you don't. Leveling needs to become a regular part of your procedures. What I've seen is they will tie links, say, between these activities so that they stay where they're at. So they're always leveled. But here's what happens. I'm going to schedule now. Notice how I've turned red. These activities might be independent jobs and they aren't related to each other at all, but we have just linked them together for the sake of resource leveling. But now we've imposed a critical path here. If you do that enough and you sequence a bunch of specific jobs together, what you end up doing is removing the float, and pretty soon you may have a critical path that you were not expecting. I work in downstream turnaround groups, and I've seen situations where valve jobs, numerous valve replacement jobs were linked together and they all of a sudden turned critical. And the management team was saying, how can these valves be critical? They're 1 or 2 or 3 day jobs, 5 or 6 activities each. There was no reason for these things to turn critical. Well, what had happened is the scheduler had cross-linked these jobs to each other, even though they were all unrelated to each other. He did this for the sake of leveling, and it caused a critical path that was invalid. So that's something you want to watch out for. Point being here is that if you leave P6 dynamic and you make leveling part of your standard practice, then you just level every time. Next, I want to show you what happens in P6 when we apply progress to activities, but we do it out of sequence. I want to explain how P6 then levels the remaining work. Before I do that, I want to point out one thing here though. The total float column is showing here, and you'll notice that the total float is still 20 hours on each activity. That's because in the leveling settings, we left this turned on, which says preserve scheduled early and late dates. So actually in the background, if you pulled in the early start, early finish, late start, and late finish fields, those would be actual scheduled fields. They would not be leveled dates inside those fields. Your start field and your finish field would show the level dates, which is kind of nice because you could compare what is scheduled versus what is leveled. In our P6 advanced training course here at TEPCO, we actually explain how to use some user-defined fields to show leveled versus scheduled out in the Gantt chart. But I also wanted to point out this field, which you may or may not have ever used. It's called remaining float. Remaining float actually does show what the remaining float is against the level dates. You may want to get used to showing the remaining float as well as the total float so that you have a clear understanding of what the float is based on the level dates. Now I'm going to show you what happens when we progress an activity out of sequence. So I'm going to choose activity number 2 and I'll bring in the activity details tabs here. I'm going to go ahead and start this activity and I'll mark it as finished. I am going to back it up a day to show that it actually was started and finished on Monday instead, when what we would have liked to have seen done, or what we had originally scheduled to have done, was have the first activity start on Monday. Now I'm going to schedule first, and in doing so I have to move the data date ahead now because we have progress on Monday already and Monday has passed. So I'm going to move that up one day. I'm going to schedule. As you might have expected, the completed task is now on the left of the data date where it should be, and the 2 remaining activities are to the right of the data date. And in scheduled, they're both riding the data date. If I turn on my resource profile again, you'll see that they are showing an overload as well. Now, what happens in this scenario when we level it? I will hit the level button. P6 still followed the rules that we had set up. It followed the parameters for the activity leveling priorities. So even though 2 was done, that's out of the picture now. Now it has to level activity 1 versus activity 3. And based on the leveling priorities, it did that for us. This is kind of nice because if we were to sequence these activities for the sake of leveling and we did something out of sequence like this, we would end up probably going in and breaking some logic ties. If we had used constraints, we might have to take constraints off or change them. So now we're maintaining logic and almost doing replanning while we're in the execution of the project. In this scenario, we've allowed P6 to use the rules that we set up and the parameters that we set up around leveling just to continue business as normal. The data date's been moved ahead, we leveled the remaining work, and it leveled the way that we needed it to. Now we've come towards the end of this TEPCO YouTube presentation on the basics of leveling in P6, but I wanted to show you what it looks like inside a project plan that has a lot of activities in it. This particular example has over 3,200 activities in it and probably around 100 resources. What I've done here is I have copied a baseline and the baseline is assigned, and I have turned the baseline bars orange. I'm going to level this for you so that you can see how the green bars level out in comparison to the orange. I am using activity leveling priority and total float as a secondary. I am leveling within activity total float. I do have a finish constraint on this project, and P6 will level within the time frame that I have defined now. The resource limits that I applied were not very aggressive, so I did not try and push the resources down, but you will see when we look at the green how the front loading of this schedule has now smoothed out quite a bit, and a lot of the work and the hours has pushed out to the right. I want to point out that in order to level this manually, if I were to try and do this manually, being that it's 3,200 activities and around 100 resources and numerous resource assignments, it would take me days to actually level something like this out. P6 only took a few minutes. So in closing, I just want to remind you that there are some parameters in P6 that are very important when it comes to leveling, and you want to make sure that they are correct so you can rely on the P6 results. If they are correct and you rely on the P6 results, you should be able to execute your project plan in the manner that P6 has leveled it. First of all, logical sequencing needs to be in place, and it needs to be tied off to a project finish milestone. So all independent jobs need to be sequenced within their own activity networks, but everything also still needs to be tied off to some sort of project finish milestone. As I mentioned earlier, the project is full of deliverables, and the intent is that if the deliverable is identified inside the schedule, you need to complete those items in order to call your project a finish and call it a success. The next thing you need to watch out for is to ensure that your activity leveling priorities are identified in some manner. In this particular example, I did use the 1 through 5 activity leveling priority codes. You can get more extensive and use activity codes with more values. And I also use total float as a secondaries for a tiebreaker. You can use multiple leveling priority criteria. For this particular example, the 1 through 5 leveling code was sufficient. The other thing we have to be clear about and make sure they're correct are the resource maximum units per time. Each resource has to have their limit set. P6 uses those limit lines in order to identify whether or not the activities need to be leveled out. So you want to make sure that your resource limit lines are also accurate. And another very important thing is that the budgeted hours on the activities, the number of resources and the durations and the total budgeted hours, needs to be accurate. If you build contingency into activities or you have fat built into the activities that is unnecessary, this kind of skews the leveling because P6 will try and level that contingency when really maybe you won't be using the contingency. So you don't want to put too many extra hours inside your plan. We recommend here at TEPCO that your contingency be separated activities rather than built into the original activity budgets. I'd like to thank you for watching this presentation provided by TEPCO on resource leveling within P6. If you want more information on TEPCO's services, whether it be consulting, training, or implementations, please go to www.tepco.us for more information.